All of us, I think maybe we need to introduce ourselves very briefly, Will. So I will start. I'm Charlotte Crofts. I'm the editor-in-chief of Screenworks. I've been involved with it since its inception when it was set up with John Dovey, and we'll come on to that when we talk about the history. I'm based at the University of West of England. I'm an associate professor of filmmaking. I'm a filmmaker. I'm also interested in screen heritage, and I'm becoming more interested in green filmmaking and also issues around access, which is another thing that we're going to be talking about. Will, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Good morning. Hi, everyone. Very happy to be here. Thank you. I am Will DeGravio. I am in New York at the moment, as Charlotte alluded to. So if it sounds like I just woke up, it's because I kind of am. I recently earned an MPhil from Cambridge. I've been on the Screenworks staff for the past going on 2 years and host the Video Essay podcast. And I'm primarily interested in all things videographic criticism. I'm looking forward to sharing our conversation today and channeling my podcast host skills. So thank you very much.
Who wants to go next? Catherine?
Hello, everyone. I'm Catherine Gough Brady, calling in from Melbourne in Australia. And I'm part of this amazing team at Screenworks. I'm an award-winning doco maker, and I've moved into academia in the last kind of 5 years or so. And at the moment, I'm most interested in ways that we might film the non-human or decenter the human in the frame.
Estrella?
Hi everyone, my name is Estrella Sembra and I'm based at SOAS, University of London, and at Winchester School of Art, University of Southampton, so not very far from you in Solent University. And I joined Screenworks this January, and I was very happy to do so. Last year, I started to experiment with my students, implemented video essays as a creative assessment method for the first time in the School of Arts at SOAS. And I was very interested in this creative dimension of research because of my background as well as a documentary filmmaker who has struggled to find an academic space for this kind of practice. And ever since I created the introductory guide to video essays, and I made my first 2 video essays. So this is the area that I'm most interested in, but I'm also very interested in seeing how different kinds of pieces, experimental fiction and so on, can be considered as research and make us reflect a little bit more about the social impact of the things we often theorize about.
Shweta?
Hi everyone, good morning. Really happy to be here. This is Shweta Ghosh. I am based at the University of Reading at the Department of Film, Theatre and Television. I am just about to finish my PhD, and I'm also a part-time lecturer at the department. And I'm also a documentary filmmaker, and I'm interested in practice-based research is what I've done for my PhD. I'm interested in questions of sort of disability access to filmmaking and research, and sort of looking at multi-methodological interdisciplinary projects related to creativity, expression, and overall just questions of inclusion and access, basically. Yeah, I'm really happy to be a part of Screenworks since January, and we've been working on exciting things already, which I can't wait to share with everyone. Yeah.
I'm going to go to Matthew first and then Alex.
Thanks, Charlotte. Good morning, everyone. I'm Matthew Hawkins. I'm a senior lecturer in film practice at London's South Bank University. My work is really concerned with, I guess, broadly speaking, film philosophy and film practice. My PhD was on affects and narrative cinema, but I also engage with sort of experimental documentary. I'm not actually tied into any particular form that closely. I'm sort of more broadly speaking a filmmaker. So it depends on the project and the concept, and I like to sit in the gaps between these, experimental fiction and documentary. That's where I find myself most at home, most interesting. And I've also been part of Screenworks only since January, and it's been already really exciting and really interesting, and I'm learning a lot, actually.
Hi everyone, I'm Alex. I'm a cinematographer and filmmaker, currently a senior lecturer at Nottingham Trent University. I've been involved with Screenworks since 2016, I think. And that came about because I was doing my PhD at the University of West of England at the time. And John Dovey, who founded the journal with Charlotte, was one of my supervisors. So I was able to kind of get involved as an editor through that really. And it's been a great 5 years so far participating.
Thank you, Alex. And like I said, I'm a budding young scholar, so getting to work with all these amazing scholars is an incredible learning opportunity for me, and I'm sure it's going to be a great conversation today. We want to keep things kind of loose, so feel free to just put questions in the chat and we can kind of bring them up as we move along, but we'll try and save some time for questions at the end. Darren gave a great introduction to Screenworks, but Charlotte, my first question is over to you. For someone who might not be overly familiar with the journal, could you just provide a brief history of Screenworks and just discuss generally the types of works that we typically publish?
Thanks, Will. So the journal's been going for a while. The first issue, I think, was published in I thought it was 2006, I think it's 2007. But it obviously, it was instigated, I think, in around 2005, and it grew out of a whole set of anxieties, which I think are still ongoing, although I feel things have moved along since then. And the anxieties grew out of an organisation called AMPE, which was the Association for Media Practice Educators, got subsumed into MEXA, which was more of a traditional kind of methodology-based media, cultural communications, as you know. And there was a sense that the people involved with AMPE were feeling, you know, that practice wasn't going to be recognised in this new amalgamation. There were a lot of anxieties about whether practice was research and how it could be evaluated and all this kind of stuff. And I was involved in that, and I became the first MEXA practice section chair, which is now Network. And I was involved in the consultation on the RAE in 2008, and John Dovey, I think it was at Salford, and Eric Knudsen and various people were involved in a kind of pilot of how one might do peer review of practice research, because there was no vehicle for practice research to be peer reviewed, which seemed to be the mechanism by which it would be accepted by the Academy as research. So there was this amazing symposium, I think it was a J&P symposium at Salford, where we did little workshops on how we might peer review some stuff, and that is how Screenworks was born, led by John Dovey. I was the associate editor for the first volume, and I think there was a real emphasis that we wanted to show the peer review process, which is why we published the peer reviews. So it was to give a kind of, you know, and we could look back and perhaps, because we still do publish the peer reviews, think that this is terribly conformist to some sort of neoliberal agenda where practice has to conform to the straitjacket of what research is seen. But I think we can have that discussion later. But at that time, it was felt it was necessary to publish the peer reviews in order to demonstrate the researchness of practice. Since then, when the field of practice research has become more established, we've had, haven't we, Alex, we've had discussions about should we still be publishing the peer review, and we've decided for the time being that yes, it is a really useful intervention to show the process. It's kind of like breaking the fourth wall in a way. Show the process of peer review, and I think like journals should publish the peer reviews, to be fair. But it does cause issues when the reviews are negative or invite substantial rewriting, and so we have been quite flexible about if authors want to respond to the peer review in different ways, and we'll talk about that later. But to go back to the history, that first issue came out in the days when it was a DVD that was attached to the Journal of Media Practice, and there was a relationship with the Journal of Media Practice, and there was a kind of a website where thumbnails and little clips from the films were there, but you had to get the actual journal through the DVD through the journal. And then there was a second, I went on maternity leave, and there was a second issue, and that was still a DVD, I believe. And then when I came back, it kind of had ground to a halt, and John Dovey had moved on to bigger and better and brighter things, and had left the University of Bristol where the original website was. And so we had no way to access or control or do anything with that website. And we had this really weird website, which was a joint effort with the Journal of Media Practice, and Screenworks had a section that we could have control of. But then that was defunct. And so in about 2010-11, it had ground to a halt, and the journal nearly stopped being. And I just thought, it's such a good thing and it needs to keep going. So I kind of like whipped together a WordPress site, and kind of initially I was trying to kind of continue the relationship with the Journal of Media Practice. But in the end, they had a facility to publish video, so they kind of broke with us. So we just forged ahead, and it is very much a cottage industry. It hasn't got huge institutional support, and that's something that Alex has been instrumental in trying to bring sustainability and longevity to the journal through engaging us with Crossref and with the what's the DOAJ stand for, Alex? I've gone completely blank. Indexing.
Directory of Open Access Journals, I think. Yes,
that, and we do anti-plagiarism software, although I'm not sure whether people would plagiarize themselves in their research statements. And we have some support from the Digital Cultures Research Centre at UE, and but that's literally to cover the website hosting and stuff like that, and the Crossref. But there isn't a huge amount of administrative support, and it is kind of a bit Heath Robinson in the way that we do stuff. We're not located within a submissions platform. We've found our own ways of doing that, but they seem to kind of work. We do end up publishing things eventually. We've been very hit by COVID, and people's ability to engage with reviewing work is, people have a lot of other things that they're contending with, and that slowed down a lot in the last year. But don't know whether it's because it's the ref. We've had a bumper issue this year, so we've managed to kind of forge through that. So in terms of the history, that's a brief overview of, it emerged out of anxieties about practice research, which I think are still there, and I think this conference addresses in really interesting ways. Things have definitely moved on. I'm going to have to stop talking because I'm running out of, I need to go and get a drink of water. But do you want to, because Alex has been with the journal through some of these major kind of changes in the infrastructure. I don't know whether I can hand over to you while I go and grab a drink of water, Alex, to chip in.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the only thing I would add to what Charlotte's mentioned there is that the editorial board has kind of expanded and shrunk a few times in the last sort of 5 or 6 years since I've been involved. And at the moment, it seems to be really exciting that we have a lot of new faces who've been with us since January, and who are bringing all these new ideas that I'm sure you'll hear about in this discussion. So yeah, probably quite out of the journals that publish practice research, there were a few. I think Screenworks is quite a long-standing one, and hopefully we'll keep going too.
Back in the room. Sorry about that. Has anyone got any questions about that so far? There's a comment from Pratap. Fantastic work. It's so important, such support to our community. Oh, thank you.
I see Mark says he has a copy of that DVD, the first DVD. I think I want to track down one of those. It seems like it's an important historical artifact.
Have you still got a DVD player?
Thank you, Charlotte and Alex, for that great overview. We're going to follow up on many of the things, Charlotte, that you just mentioned. Oh, Mark says he can rip it. Thank you. Yes, would love that. This question of this next question I'm going to ask you, Alex, but I would encourage everyone who's on the board to then follow up because it's rather broad, and I'm sure we could have an interesting discussion about it. But what is practice as research or practice research? They're two terms that are often used in a variety of contexts. What forms does it take? And more specifically, how does Screenworks interpret the term when evaluating works for publication? I know that's something that we often discuss in board meetings when we decide whether a work is a good fit for the journal. So Alex, I'll turn it over to you, but if anyone else wants to chime in after, please feel free to do so.
Yeah, and I don't think alone I'll be able to answer that. It's quite a huge and a good question there, Will. Also, I think to try and answer it fully in this context, given the theme of the conference and some of the other contributions that we've heard, wouldn't do justice to the question at all. But essentially, I think, practice research as a methodology goes back to at least the 1990s, Christopher Frayling's kind of article about research into, through, and for art and design. But really the type of work that we're talking about when we say practice research has a much longer history that we can, I'm sure, get stuck into in the conversation. I think one thing that's important to note, and that Darren alluded to in the brilliant introduction to this, was the significance of research review activities in forming practice research, particularly the REF in the UK or the ERA in Australia, where practitioners who were working in former polytechnics or universities were obviously kind of forced to validate or confront their work on the same terms as more traditional forms of research that had been happening. And so Charlotte and I, in an article that we wrote a few years ago, sort of charted some of these histories in and how they related to practice research as it now exists for Screenworks. I think some of the arguments around the sort of validation of practice as research or practice research have sort of been settled or sort of won by people who are practitioners working in the academy more recently. And there's a huge range of terms beyond the ones that you mentioned, Will. Obviously, artistic research has been mentioned, but practice-led as well would be another term that's quite popular. And broadly speaking, it's, I think, from a Screenworks point of view, any inquiry that has that has a practical component that's integral to its investigation. We typically focus on screen media, so it's short film submissions for the most part, but we have received some sort of interactive online works or some sort of feature-length works as well more recently. We have work that uses film as a sort of method of collaboration to bring together communities of learning that have been submitted. We have work that explores filmmaking as a site of investigation itself. So we try not to be too prescriptive about what practice research is as a journal. And I think we're also kind of constantly open to reconsidering what type of work we publish too.
Thank you, Alex. Is there anyone else on the board who would like to chime in? Matthew, I saw you unmute yourself.
Yeah, sorry. Because I say it's a huge question, but I've been drawn recently through my head of research at LSBU. She constantly refers back to this Frascati definition of research, which I know the REF uses, which is a really interesting one. And there are sort of 5 key terms that define research, and that it has to be novel, creative, uncertain, systematic, and transferable, and or reproducible. And I think anybody who engages in some kind of creative practice, all of whether it's film, photography, sculpture, or whatever, fulfills that sort of definition almost by default, right? All of the work we do is novel, it's new, it's inherently creative. Everything I do is uncertain, certainly at the beginning. Systematic workflows are really important for screen practice, definitely. And transferable and reproducible. And this comes back to the written statement. A good written statement can ensure that work is reproducible, right? So it can be taken, reproduced, and actually taken forth and maybe built upon by other creative practitioners as well. So I think that's quite a good one. And in terms of the practice as well, I mean, it can work in many different ways. I think the act of making a creative piece of practice changes the way I think about a particular concept, right? So the way I think in front of a keyboard is totally different from the way I think when I'm behind my camera, right? And that offers up unique opportunities to create new concepts and new ideas that wouldn't ever happen if I was just in front of my keyboard or just in a library, right? It allows me to engage in the world in a different way, regardless of the finished output. It's almost in that sense, the film can almost be not important, but the act of creating the film changes my thinking and my kind of almost ontological engagement with the world. And I think that's really important in and of itself. And that's harder to quantify, but it shouldn't be overlooked, I don't think.
I was going to chip in. I mean, obviously the definition of research is new knowledge effectively shared. And I think it's the effectively shared bit that Screenworks can speak to, because we can be artists and we do research as part of our art, but is it research in the traditional sense of effectively shared? I mean, going to Des's paper, which I thought was really, really interesting. And I think, just to echo what Alex said, we've got a very, very open idea of, you know, how we approach submissions, and very rarely do we think, well, this isn't really research, it's a presentation that's been recorded, and that's different from a videographic film, you know, or, you know, mostly we're very open to stuff that's submitted to us. As I say, I'd really like to see more fiction filmmaking, and explore that, because I think that there's still challenges around that, for the same reason that the reviewer two of mine said it was just filmmaking, not research. But yeah, I think we're very, very open, and I think that for me, I think what I hope that we're doing is just providing a process, because I think sometimes through the process of applying, we have had, and this is another question you're coming to later, I think, Will, you know, I think just that process of having to articulate your research, your research and your practice to other people helps you to really refine it and understand what you were doing, and understand what those methodologies and those different approaches and that different relationship to knowledge is, which Matthew was referring to.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to add something in relation to this idea of them being effectively shared. I think that this aligns very well with our current efforts that Shweta and Catherine will talk about later on ideas around accessibility. So I think that this is a way of thinking of how we can make our research more accessible in terms of its reproduction and access, let's say, reception, but also in terms of who is the storyteller behind what is being published. When we think of it as a methodology where there are researchers behind. So I think that this aligns very well with current direction that pushed me as well, for example, to join this team. And it was that commitment or engagement with decolonizing research. And this is one of my main areas of interest, and it's both theoretical and methodological. And one of the things that I suggest in some of the work that I've been doing is that this is also a way of trying to decolonize academia by telling things in a different way.
Can I come back in there briefly, Will, and just say that when thinking about the effectively shared element as well, there is the matter of sort of longevity and how the work that we are outputting is actually preserved for the world. And I think a journal like Screenworks can be integral in offering the opportunity for practitioners to have their work accessible through libraries or through other forms where film research otherwise might not be seen by academics. So there's that sort of challenge that we're still wrestling with, and I'm sure other people might have ideas about in this discussion and conference around how you actually preserve an ephemeral form of practice, because the sharing is obviously an integral element.
Thank you, everyone, for that. That's a great transition to the next question I had. But before we do, does Catherine or Shweta, do either of you want to chime in here? If not, I can move on, but just wanted to make sure.
Sorry, I'm all good for us to move on. I think I agree with what Matthew said, and Alex and Estrella and Charlotte. It's just been interesting, yeah.
Yep, same.
Great. Well, this you know, piggybacking off what Alex said, and why I had known that the first issue or the first couple issues were published via DVD, but that raises many interesting questions for how Screenworks submissions are currently published, which is they are typically the work itself is I think exclusively Vimeo for the most part, embed on the website. So the only portion of the submission that is truly published by the journal is the research statement, which I think raises all sorts of interesting questions, as Alex said, about archiving and access, and just the notion that because the person submitting the work controls the Vimeo link, they could make the video private and remove it at any point, unless it's no longer on the journal website. But we can get into that in this conversation. But just to take a step back, I'd be curious, Charlotte, to know the history of the research statement, because for those who aren't familiar, when you submit a work to Screenworks, you're required to sort of follow, as Charlotte alluded to, somewhat of a structure, and there are 6 sections typically to each submission. your research questions, your context, your methods, your outcomes, your impact, and your bibliography. So I have several questions about the research statement, but first, Charlotte, could you give us a quick overview of how those 6 sections came into being and what was the thinking behind them?
Yeah, so I think that John Dovey developed those headings, but they speak to the kind of definition, not definition, but how we assess research, which is around originality, significance, and rigor. So they are designed to enable the person who's writing the statement to be able to show those aspects of their research. So the methodology will speak to rigor, the significance will be explored through how it's been disseminated and the impact, and then the context gives you a sense of the significance and how it relates to other research in the field. And I think that's sometimes an area where practice research can really benefit from having a research statement, because it enables you to reflect on how your own practice relates to other artistic practice, but also other theories within our discipline. And how you are adding to the knowledge, because I guess the way that we assess research and the quality of research is how it's adding to the conversation and moving the conversation forward. And you can show that through just the practice, obviously. And I'm not saying that we can't, but it just is a way to put that on your sleeve in a really obvious way and, effectively share it. Perhaps to a broader constituency, so that people can understand. I think a lot of the anxiety that around how Screenworks was first set up was about less so about whether practice can be researched, but more so about proving it to those people who are skeptical about it. And often that's not the funding organisations, and it's not the ref who are very open to practice research. It's the gatekeepers within your own institution who put you forward for the the ref and how they frame your practice, or how they see you within your own academy, within your own institution. And I think that that is still a problem. I think practice research within individual institutions varies immensely at how well it's kind of received and supported within different institutions. But I think the ref, I'm involved in the ref panel, obviously there's lots of confidentiality, and I can't talk to you in detail about that because I'll have to murder you all if I slip up and tell you anything, because the confidentiality is really important in this process. But a general overview is that practice is very well received, and that what we're doing in the research exercise is, I've got to show you my post-it note that's stuck on my screen because I'm in the middle of the process now. We're looking for excellence. It's not about gatekeeping, it's about searching for excellence. And I think when you have something published in a journal like Screenworks, and the other ones Alex mentioned, there's lots of other ones as well in transition, JAR, and what's the one in Australia, Catherine? Sightlines.
Sightlines, yeah.
Sightlines. Yeah. So we're not the only one, but several of those journals do cite Screenworks in their kind of, what they've been inspired by the way that Screenworks is done, and they do things differently, and they have their own way of doing things. But what I'm trying to say is that I actually think the anxiety is more in the institutions that are submitting the research rather than in the leading bodies. So I've just gone on a big ramble really, but those headlines are speaking to originality, significance, and rigor, and enabling the researcher or the practitioner to articulate that in a way that those people that might be skeptical about practice research can see the research. It's kind of telegraphing it as research.
No, thank you for that, Charlotte. And I'll ask a quick follow-up question to go over to Alex, and we'll just go right off what you just said there, because you made reference to In Transition, which is a journal that you and Alex mentioned. For those who aren't familiar, Alex and Charlotte wrote an article on publishing screen media practice research, published in Media Practice and Education in 2018. And In Transition is a journal that you referred to in that piece, just to kind of compare. And In Transition, which is a journal of videographic moving image criticism, they also publish short paratexts by those who submit to the journal, but it's far more loose than I think our journal. Someone might opt to write a single paragraph. I've seen submissions where they just allow the work to speak for itself, or I've seen paratexts that function as a mini journal article in and of itself. So why does Screenworks require the practice statement? Charlotte, you've kind of given us some reason why, but I just more anecdotally, have there been instances where people have wanted to just submit without the statement? What would your response be to that? And why not simply, you know, let the work speak for itself? And Alex, I'll go over to you, and then again, if anyone else wants to chime in after, feel free.
And nothing. I think for me, you can publish it on Vimeo, and your work speaks for itself. And the motivation for people to want to be published in Screenworks is to evidence the peer review of their work, to show the rigor of their work. So we could still be peer reviewed, and peer reviews could not be published. And I think the publication of the peer reviews arose initially out of that anxiety of kind of showing the workings, showing our working outs. And we've had various debates, haven't we, Alex, prior to the current board being members, where we've hotly contested whether we still need to publish those peer reviews, because they have, the status of practice research has become more accepted, and there's less anxiety. But we've decided to keep publishing them, and but we found ways to enable practitioners to respond to the peer reviews directly if they want to. So sometimes there's a right of reply if there's been disagreements between different peer reviewers, or if the submission has substantially changed in relation to what was the peer reviews were originally writing about. And I mean, it's something that we might revisit. And there are people in the audience who've submitted to the journal, and hope to invite them to speak in a minute, because I think that's going to be something that we're going to talk about, people's experience. But just anecdotally, I think some people have had very difficult experiences, and some reviewers are less able to write constructive reviews than others, but generally our reviewers are amazing, and most of the reviews are written in a very constructive kind of way. And some people have found the reviews really useful in helping them to refine the way that they express their practice research, or to helping sometimes people submit practice which they are inviting to be kind of formatively assessed. So sometimes it actually impacts on the actual submission of the film or practice itself. The hope is that the peer review process is a supportive and provoking as well, to keep to the theme of the conference, but a stimulating experience. And I know, I think there's somebody in the audience who would like to speak to that. I know, Catherine, you've been through the peer review process before joining the board. If you wanted to come in first, and then.
Sure. So what I find interesting is that the peer review process engages more and more with the film work, or the audiovisual work, as well as the statement. And I feel like sort of early days, it was much more around people didn't ask you to make changes in your film or engage so much with that. There was a sort of kind of fear of engaging with the creative work, and a prioritizing of the word and engaging with that. And I think that we're kind of shifting in this really exciting way, where those peer reviews are starting to engage. And I'm waiting for the day when someone sends a non-text peer review, because why not? And so I find that process interesting, because it makes me think back on the film, and in terms of this research idea, as opposed to, like if you think about it in the industry, you write a synopsis, and you might write, like there is documentation around what you do that exists. And in a sense, we're creating a type of documentation around it, which, as you were talking about before, provides that context and gives people a kind of greater understanding of how it might be situated within the other work that's existing out there, which you might not necessarily be in the work itself, and to point the kind of researcher to some of those things in the piece. I found the peer reviewing process at Screenworks really fantastic, so I recommend submitting to the journal. It's been really positive engagement with the types of things that I've been trying to do within creative practice. There's a kind of openness to the idea of creative practice. But yeah, I'd like to share with others for experiences.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's Agnieszka Petrowska, who's in the audience, who's gone through quite a long and drawn out peer review process. So it'd be really interesting to hear her perspective. Are you able to spotlight Agnieszka and invite her in, who did a wonderful keynote? If you haven't seen it, there's a recording of it online, looking at some of her videographic film criticism. Are you there? Are you going to pipe up? Hello.
Hi guys, I'm here. Thank you so much. Thank you for being here. Thank you very much for inviting me to be a keynote and have an opportunity to be speaking about the work needing to be political one way or another, which I think is important. So my experience of Screenworks has been very interesting. I've published with them twice. I've published 3 pieces though, which is something that I'll talk about briefly. The first submission was I guess, Charlotte, we could say it was quicker. It was a quicker process, right? It was a documentary. It was an experimental documentary shot in Zimbabwe. But there was also some of it is to do with me, because I think as a maker, I like to make things. I know many people will recognize it, and then kind of, I find even though I write a lot in terms of books and articles, but I do find writing the research statement a laborious process, and because you kind of make things and you think, here we go, the work should speak for itself. But I will say, so even the first, the Lovers in Time documentary, I did find it quite difficult, but I will say, and I mean it, even with the first one, I am happy that I went through the process. And as Charlotte says, for lots of reasons also, and I was able then to use that process in other ways, in other work. It forced me to reflect more. It pushed me to, because I really wanted to publish in Screenworks. So I had to do it, or else I could just say, whatever, but I wanted to, so I had to do it the way that colleagues have asked me to do it. The second one, which has been published recently, the second submission, there is a whole saga, and I think, again, I have to say, it's not Pollyannish. I am a positive person, but I will say it really was in the end a good experience. It was tough, but it was good. I first submitted just and both the second submission, which is, as I say, recently published. In the first instance, I submitted this experimental drama called Repented on its own. And again, with a slightly sloppy research statement, probably, to be honest, to be truthful. And also because the piece of work that Repented was kind of traveled around the world, was considered very successful. And I thought, I didn't think that, but there was some unconscious processes that I wasn't as rigorous as I would be if it was just an article. So anyway, all kinds of things happened, and one of the reviewers, and I think that reviewer is still published in Screenworks, again, the story of a negative review. But then I spoke to Alex and Charlotte, and it really made me think harder what I was trying to do here with my practice. And why? What am I actually doing here? And so I've asked for the permission if I could publish a short film. So in this one submission, there will be 2 films to show the research journey in order to look at the intimate relationships in colonial and post-colonial situation. And I am really pleased with the result. I'm really proud of how these 2 pieces sit together and how Screenworks as a team, we work together. I mean, it also was kind of up to me because you get fed up. You think, oh, for goodness sake. But I then thought, no, wait a minute, go step back and work harder. And I really respect that process, and I like it. And I mean it most sincerely, guys. I really think that we work together well, because the final result was really good. And my research statement makes a proper contribution to knowledge, thanks to you, thanks to our work together, thanks to the openness And it's hard because you think, oh, for goodness sake, it just should be on its own. You know, the work should just be. And then you have to say, okay, but if you wanted to be published and treated as practice research, that you simply have to work harder. But it's a, you know, it's a good thing. So
Thank you. Agnieszka, thank you so much for your comments. And Alex looked after your submission, and it was drawn out by the fact that we had a very difficulty with COVID, and people are being a lot more slow with the reviews. And thank you so much to all our reviewers for your time, you know, your unpaid time doing this. We know that it's in addition to lots of other work. And it's really heartening to hear that you found, although it was difficult, because it's really important for Screenworks to be rigorous. We can't just, you know, there's Vimeo. If you just want to publish a film on Vimeo. It is about recognising the process. And yes, you could, if you want to be really argumentative and provoking, you could say, well, we're just subscribing to these neoliberal kind of evaluation exercises and things like that. But I think the whole way in which the people involved in those exercises, it is about celebrating and seeing the excellence in the research. And what I hope we've done is enable you to publish a you know, really profound piece of filmmaking, but to effectively share the research, you know, and the process. And Alex, I think, managed your submission very well, because you've been able to really engage in that process.
I just want to say also, it's very important, I think, to make it, you know, to differentiate between the idea of neoliberal, when we are, as I mentioned in my keynote, when we really invited to commodify ideas, and it doesn't work like this. Sometimes, you know, we can talk this way today, this morning, and hopefully these ideas will ripple through our institutions, our work, but it's not easy to say, well, how is it impacting? It just is, because we think. That is very different from somebody saying, you know, how many people watched your thing, or it's just nonsense, you know, and that is not. So I think Screenworks and other journals mentioned there, it's not neoliberal at all if it's done properly, if it's a proper space for exchanging ideas and learning. And we are also, I think, fearful. This is my big thing, you know, in my keynote, because Roy was saying, don't be too long, don't be too long, be 30 minutes or 31, don't go on. So I had the whole other thing for 5 minutes going on, which I then just cut and didn't, which I was talking about fear, that we are so scared all the time. It's ridiculous, you know, that we might get fired, that we might get this and that our work won't be appreciated properly. And the resistance is to say, you know, that's far no further, you know, as long as we are creative people, we keep going ourselves, talking to each other and listening to the peer feedback. And that is not the same as being tortured by, you know, by the management. It's a different thing. And I think it's very important to recognize it, Charlotte, and thank you. And Alex, thank you so much.
I'm so relieved to hear that you had a positive experience overall, and Agnieszka, I know it was a long-winded one. But there is actually, I just wanted to go back to Will's earlier question and say there is one, we do have people treating the research statement very differently, and the approach to the, you know, these written headings that we have can lead to different forms of writing. I think one of my favorite examples is when Susanna Ramsey submitted a film poem submission a while back, and the peer reviewer actually responded in poetic form to each work with a series of these kind of, you know, really beautifully written poems, as well as a more kind of critical academic statement. So within, even though we have this rigor and this kind of parity really between submissions of using the set headings, there is still room to explore and try new ideas, I think.
There was a question in the chat, sorry to jump in, Will, because I know you probably want to come to other questions, but I think Jill Daniels, did you want to ask that in person, Jill? Or shall I just read it out? Let us know somehow.
Yeah, you could read it out, I guess. I'm not sure if it's a question or a comment.
But it was just, I think you were asking something, was it you? You were asking something about when there's a kind of a right to reply to the peer review, or revoking the work if it's been accepted but they don't like the peer reviews being published.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So yeah, my point really was, I think especially people who are early career researchers, having critique of their work, which is quite negative, even though it's been accepted for publication, feels like it's not necessarily helpful to where they're going, really, I guess, even though it might be useful for people to read outside of the work. And then I've decided not to publish because of that, which means that then there's less access for them to disseminate their work. So I think it's that supportive environment which is really needed. So I do really welcome that idea of a debate that can happen.
Oh, am I still unmuted? We have had instances where it's very rare that people withdraw if it's been accepted for that reason, or we've had instances where we've been able to offer a third or a re-peer review, or the person's had a right to reply to the peer review. And that's been done very much on a case-by-case basis according to what we think would be best for the actual submission. And I think although it is sometimes difficult, I hate being peer reviewed, and I'm in the process of rewriting something at the moment where I responded to all of the peer reviews. This is a written article, not the peer reviews won't be published, but I responded to all of the points, and then it became really long and I have to now redo it all. So it's just really annoying. It's a horrible process, it's painful, but it will be a better article. And I think also that our reviewers, people who review regularly for us, understand that this is a dialogue and rather than a gatekeeping exercise. And I think that has, and also sometimes when we've had peer reviews that aren't particularly helpful or publishable, we've had to go back to the peer reviewers to say, this will be published, can you reframe this in a way that's publishable? I don't know if you want to speak to that, any of the other, Alex, you've had a bit more experience of peer review than the newbies, but do you want to add anything to that?
Not particularly. I mean, I think, as you've mentioned, it's all about giving the opportunity for people to actually develop their work. And often, I think the best examples, like Agnieszka's, are works where it looks quite different in the final published version than in the original. And there is this disparity sometimes between, the written statements that appear alongside the work in the final piece and what the final piece actually represents. So we do preface each review with this statement that the original work has been changed. But I guess that would be one, when we've gone over this in previous editorial meetings, that would be one criticism of publishing the reviews, is that often they don't necessarily speak to the final piece because they've been amended. So I think there's all sorts of ways of looking at this. I don't have too much to add.
I guess it's quite there's pluses and minuses, as we kind of well know, but I think publishing the peer reviews is really sort of establishing a kind of discourse that says, as we've kind of established, I think that it is a collegial process and it's about kind of making our work better. I've read, and colleagues have shared with me, and I've had a few myself over the years, of fully anonymous peer reviews that have been quite horrific. And I don't know how anybody could write such horrible things that are just sort of mean-spirited sometimes. And if that went to an early career researcher, that could be quite traumatic, and it could actually kind of ruin a career almost. I don't know how that would affect people going forward. And that's certainly something that doesn't happen so much at Screenworks, I don't think. And just the work that's been done by sort of Charlotte and Alex and the rest of the team over the years, it seems more of a positive process. And actually there is a section in the peer review, the inner troll, Mark, exactly. There is a section in the peer review that you can give comments to the author that won't be published. And there's been recently some kind of really great peer reviews that have said, like, this work is great, this isn't to be published, but if you made a few of these changes, I think it would just make the work better. And it was really beautiful and really well received by the author as well. So there are areas in which you can make comments that might not necessarily be published, but would help to improve the work, which I think is a really great initiative.
That's quite a recent addition to our peer review form, to enable the peer reviewer to write comments that won't be published, but that help to shape the work. And I think that that might address some of the concerns that Jill was mentioning. Jill had another thing which was about, which I think is a really good point. And I'm sorry, Will, if this preempts a question that you've got, but some of the films that we do publish have a life, as Darren was pointing out, that Bluebell went to festivals beforehand, or they are pay-per-view video on demand things, or, you know, so we've got a few instances where we've published a trailer initially, or an extract, and one of the jobs of our new editorial board is to kind of go through and look at broken links and look at you know, those instances where we haven't published the full work, and whether it's possible to approach the contributor to see whether we can include the full work because it's done its festival rounds and things like that. But we try and enable the publication. Ideally, we want to publish the full work because we want to be an open access journal in full time, but occasionally we're still keen to publish stuff that's still live, if that makes sense. I don't know if anyone wanted to add anything to that.
I just wanted to kind of, oh, go on.
No, you go.
I'm just thinking back to the question of the research statement, and I think it just, I'm also thinking of, say, my kind of research, which is very community-based and is, you know, doing, say, workshops with filmmakers, and it helps for the research statement and the video work to be a dance rather than look at it as, you know, they complement each other really beautifully. So rather than think of why this isn't the work supposed to speak for itself, there are some kinds of video work which might not allow for the space, you know, to include all of it that you really like to as a research work. But it's also really nice to see what aspects you can present really strongly in video and in writing and bring those together. And I think that allows for that flexibility for the research to just be like to broaden out what kinds of research we welcome in the journal as well. So yeah, just that.
And I think on that too, like when I'm creating video works, there can be a thing that you're making for the audience, and then there can be another layer, which is what you're looking at yourself for your own research and development. And in the statement, you can actually reveal that to, you know, the reader and go, actually, this little moment here, that's the key moment when it comes to what I'm doing, as opposed to all the other bits that you were watching. Yeah. And on the archive, I am emailing people, so you might get an email from me at some stage going, please let me have access to full-length bits.
Thank you all for sharing your perspective. And I want to follow up quickly with Matthew here, because you've touched on this a little bit, but as someone who's written peer reviews for the journal, I'm wondering if you could just take us inside that process for you, how you navigated, as Shweta probably said, that dance between the written statement and the actual work that you were reviewing. And also, how did it shape the review at all, knowing that it would be made partially public? Just take us inside the process, if you would.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, I hope it wouldn't shape the review because it's public, because I would hope that I'm professional enough to write a collegial and positive or at least constructive review, regardless of whether it's being published or not. But I guess you can't not be conscious that it will be available to be read by a wider audience, right? So I guess even on an unconscious level, that's going to be there. You know, it's going to be read. So maybe I would do more spell checking, I don't know, before I submitted it. But and certainly in terms of the type of work that I tend to get asked to review, that written statement for me is sort of really important, and it's a really important part of the work. And it does far more than just justifying it as research, which I know is a sort of important within, I guess, the institutional frameworks that we're kind of working in. But it helps me to understand, and it sort of illuminates and the work. And I'm really sort of interested in, I guess, the sections, because, and it's great that it's in sections because that helps, because it's only 2,000 words, right? It helps keep the statement sort of concise, and it helps really with clarity as well. So I'm really interested in the context, methods, and outcomes section of the write-up, which is sort of the main sort of body of it. Because there are some works that kind of can stand maybe more alone, maybe the audiovisual essay film. The sort of argument is almost intrinsic to the film itself quite often, not always. But certainly the work that I have reviewed in the past, which has been more sort of conceptual around sort of kind of notions of maybe film philosophy or pedagogy or other areas, the actual research is not always so clear. If you're engaging with sort of ontological questions like what is cinema, or I'm testing and trying out a new technique, I wouldn't know that you're testing out and trying out a new technique without that research statement. Right? It would be impossible for me to know sort of what you're doing. There's a couple of really good examples that I didn't peer review, but I come back to in my teaching. And that's Camrex. It's Mark Chapman's great documentary. And he engages with an idea of a documentary interiority. And you can watch the work purely for pleasure, right? And it's a great documentary that stands alone, and that's evidenced by its acceptance for film festivals and so on. But how he engages with this idea of a documentary interiority is really fleshed out in that statement, where he says explicitly, these are 4 questions that I ask. And I show this to my research project students to say, look, these are actually explicit questions. This is the research context. These are other, he evidences other people that are engaging with that work. And this is how it's implied and tested in his film. There's a poetry film, which I also show, called Trails by Wim Mason, who was mentioned that he published in the first issue. And what Mason does is he engages with, he takes a kind of poetic structure that exists in written poetry and tries to apply that structure to his kind of form of editing that exists within the film. So he's kind of creating a new form of montage, I guess, that exists in poetry but doesn't perhaps exist in moving image work. And I'm not a poet, and even if I was a poet, I probably wouldn't be able to identify that montage work in the film itself. So it's absolutely essential to have that research statement for me to understand the complexities of the work. And especially when you're talking about, like for me, the Camrex, that it deals with documentary interiority. My last film sort of engages with a documentary interiority in a different way. So it allows me, as all research does, it allows me to build upon work that's already done in my own practice, but also in my own thinking. And I really appreciate the structure of the statement as well. I was reading again Charlotte and Alex's really, I think, brilliant article in the Journal of Media Practice on sort of the history of Screenworks, and it really engages with it in a really interesting and kind of clear way some of the issues we're dealing with. And in that article, they reference one of the criticisms that was put forth in the ref to some of the creative sort of practice that was submitted. And it says a number of authored contact statements, this is from I think the 2014 ref, and peer reviews are structured by whimsical and occasionally irrelevant criteria. And certainly I know when I write about my own work, I'm not immune to whimsy. And perhaps I wouldn't be so whimsical if I was writing about somebody else's practice, right? Because I'm thinking about my own practice, maybe I would be more whimsical. The structure of the statement sort of eliminates that. It kind of helps to focus. I think the author helps to focus the reader as well. I apologize for the awful background noise. I have plumbers in today, so sorry about that. So yeah, I mean, I love the research statements, and I don't find them. I think there's all positive actually. And certainly, I've never made work outside of an academic context really. So the writing is intrinsic to the work that I do as well. So I can't almost imagine certainly my work without that writing. And I guess coming back to that methods, the way I work is I will start making the work, and then I will do some reading, and I will start writing about my work, and then that will then re-inform the edit of the film, certainly. And then that edit of the film will then change my thinking a little bit more, and I will go back to my writing again. So it really is a sort of dialogical process. Certainly that's the way that I have learned to work.
I posted a link. Sorry to cut you off there, Matthew, but just you made me think. So I posted the link to the Glisevich, Samiliana and Barclay article, and they really talk about the dialogic relationship between the statement and the practice. They reference Walter Benjamin's On Translation, which is the source text and the target text are in dialogue with each other, and the actual experience is the culmination of both of those things. And I think that's a really useful way of thinking about it. And people have talked about the dialogic relationship between the peer review and the work. So there's all sorts of conversations happening, I think, between written and practical.
And I posted Charlotte and Alex's article as well. I saw Agnieszka raised, I did the hand raised Zoom. I can see in the corner. So if we can bring back in, yes.
I just, before I leave, because I have to go at about 11:30, I just wanted to say and kind of put out a call to colleagues in terms of these reviews. And Charlotte, I'm happy to be a reviewer for Screenworks as well, but to be rigorous but kind. I think that is beginning to be a theme as well. And that is also something we can do, and that will be our resistance to the neoliberal project. There is no need to be nasty, meaning putting people down or scoring some points or saying or making comments about what it is that they would have done with the work. It's nonsense. We just need to apply our good minds, our good brains, and think really, what is the person trying to do? How can we help? What can we say if help is needed? And how can we do it generously, kindly, but rigorously? It really is not, it shouldn't be sort of rocket science, but somehow it has become in some instances, it's almost like an invitation. Some reviewers see it as an invitation to show their power. And that is the neoliberal project. That is where it's spilled to something not nice, not pleasant, not productive, not creative. And that is for me very important, that out of these conversations that we're having during this symposium, that we need to hold on to this. It's perfectly possible to be rigorous, but kind and generous. And there's something completely wrong in every way, ethically, politically, to attempt to bring a colleague down, who after all is doing something that they believe in, that is proper creative practice research. So I think for us, if I can say, it's important to reflect on this and somehow apply these standards when we review people's work.
Roy's just put in the chat that there's apparently a Facebook group called Reviewer 2 Must Be Stopped. So I shall be following that, because my Reviewer 2 obviously should have been stopped.
I believe Jill raised a hand as well, if we want to bring back into the
yeah, I just want to support what Agnieszka said. And I was just thinking if it's possible for the editorial board to look at reviews and ask them to be changed, just in the way that, if they seem to be using unacceptably aggressive language.
We have intervened with some peer reviews that we haven't felt were appropriate for publication.
Okay.
So we're hearing you, and I think the new system where there's a window that is addressed to the contributor but not published is a really nice way of doing that. But obviously we can still ensure that that's constructive as well. Thank you. Because we want to talk about.
Sorry, just one thing. It can even come down to respect in the language, just in the review, and a kind of respectful tone towards the person, even if you don't agree with their work or what they're doing. I think that's terrifically important.
Yeah, I think that's a great transition to this next question, which was offered by Estrella earlier, which is this labor of love that's involved with the submission process and being involved in the editorial board, and navigating all these things and taking your work through to submission. And I'll direct this question first to you, Estrella, and then perhaps we can go through the new members of the editorial board first, before we get back to Charlotte and Alex. But just generally, what has your experience been like now that you've been working along with the journal for the last few months? And yeah, Estrella, we'll start with you.
Thank you very much, Will, for that question. I think it builds so well with the current discussions on how to approach this peer review process, that it's aimed to be as constructive as possible. And I was suggesting to raise this point because to me, it's been, I mean, we joined in January, what a busy year. And I've been already, I mean, Matthew was saying how much he was learning already. And I think that this is something that talked to us. I feel that even though it's been a small contribution, I feel that I have already contributed, but I've been enriched so much. And I think that this is mainly due to the editorial process or way of working as a multi-directional form of care. And I wanted to raise some of these directions that care has been performing as I was experiencing it as a recent associate editor for Screenworks. So the first direction, for example, is from a mentor to a new generation. We were talking here about early career researchers, that's certainly me. And I feel that I haven't, I mean, I try to be always acknowledging of how much senior colleagues have given me, and, you know, through references for job applications, but also suggestions for amazing readings. I'm taking so many notes here of different articles you are mentioning. So again, it is this dialogical form of exchange that I think should be interpreted as care. So I think there was that first direction from a mentor to a newer generation. And this is something that it's a way in which the structure operates. Each of us has been given spontaneously a mentor in a very kind of informal way, but yet in a very supportive and rigorous way at the same time. And all of us are joined by this idea of having love for film, and that's what translates this free love for editing pieces that are film pieces very equal. And I think this responds well to Agnieszka. I'm not sure if she's still around with us, I can see her name, but with this idea of being precisely an anti-neoliberal process. This is exactly how I would define this, and therefore then can we think of this as resilient and so on. Right, I don't want to extend myself too much, but let's move now to another direction from a reviewer to a creative researcher. When writing this review, there is that careful process of thinking how I can contribute to this dialogue, to this way of knowledge production. And that's a way of recognizing as well the privilege that you have been given as a reviewer to preview the work. I mean, think about this in terms of filmmaking. Isn't the preview something so exclusive that we feel so happy to be part of? And it's probably sometimes it's a smaller screening, and it's the one in which something really magic happens. I think that happens when we engage with the work now from the living rooms that have become the amazing cinema venues this year. There's also that care from us as editorial members to reviewers, because we have to make sure that they complete the reviewing process in a timely manner. But at the same time, we need to acknowledge that this is also free labor that we are asking on top of everything else that they have on board. So we need to be flexible and sometimes extend deadlines. We need to make sure that they feel acknowledged for the labor that they have given. And then as well from an editorial team and publication itself to the audiences of the journal. I mean, I think that, for example, here there's been excellent work that has been done as well by Shweta and by Catherine. From the very beginning, they were thinking this needs to be accessible by many more people. So let's work on captions. I don't want to jump into this, but what I wanted to say in conclusion, having reflected about various directions, I think there are many more of care that are reproduced within this editorial process, are actually performed during this editorial process, is that at the end of the day, there's always in film that dialogue between whether we should use the word programmer or curator. And I think that as editors as well, we are very much behaving as curators because we are engaging in practices with care. So at the end of the day, aren't the boundaries even more blurry between practice and research? And that's what I wanted to share here today in reference to my first months as an associate editor.
Thank you very much for that, Estrella. Would anyone else like to share their experience? And now that it's been about 6 months, Shweta, Catherine.
I think that's great. I love the idea of this kind of mutual care that happens. I think I always take a much more selfish view of the world. So I really like it when people have this kind of very kind of like kind of relational approach around ideas like care. And I think one of the reasons that I pushed for some of those accessibility issues along with Shweta, it's possibly because of those selfish reasons of you want the work to reach the largest amount of audience. So why would you exclude anyone? And so the idea is, okay, how can we be the most inclusive we can? And to me, it's a no-brainer. It doesn't make sense to create something that people can't engage with. I mean, unless that's your thing that you're doing in your research, but generally you want people to be able to engage with your work. And so I think it's fantastic that we've put in work on an accessibility policy, and we're pushing to bring in captions and get people to experiment even with audio descriptions and how all this might actually interact with the work. Yeah. I don't know if Shweta, you want to pick up from that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm also thinking here broadly of one is, of course, why would we want to exclude anybody? And it's always a good time to start. So I think that's just one of the reasons which I'm so glad that Catherine has also really taken the lead on this one. But I'm also thinking of, again, relating to my research in some ways, that if we're looking at having more, I think diversity and inclusion is the big, everyone's talking about it. But how do we really put it into practice? Say, for example, if there are terminologies, I found through my research that in Indian Sign Language, for example, the language for filmmaking itself, whether it's gadgetry and technology or it's aspects of, say, mise en scène or something, there is not that much in terms of language that has developed. And how does one develop vocabulary if one doesn't interact with vocabulary, if one doesn't interact with material which is connecting one to that? So it's also from a diversity and inclusion doesn't just happen because we're saying we invite more papers, but how do we really create and scaffold those structures where we can have more people understand ideas and exchange ideas, and then that builds more work which is made by people from communities that we don't currently have enough representation from. So yeah, that's also one of the ideas hopefully behind this.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really big issue across the journals, this real divide. And I've noticed that there's those predatory journals, and it seems like if you're living in Africa or some parts of the world, that these are the journals that you end up in. And I just think it's like we're creating this two-tiered system, and it's quite important to break it down, not just for those equity issues, but also because won't the conversations be amazing that we get out of that between the different cultures and different ways of thinking? Yeah.
I don't know, because Will, there was a specific question about the accessibility, which I don't know if you wanted to ask, but I was just going to chip in, and I've really valued the really lovely comments, Estrella, about the kind of the way the care that goes on. I'd never thought about it in those terms, and it was a really lovely way of thinking about it. And I have to say that we're all fitting this into very, very busy lives, but each of you, and Alex, who's been with the journal a long time, has brought so much to it in terms of making it the infrastructure more rigorous, and these new interventions, because I know that we're working on, we will eventually update our website, which has been an ongoing agenda item for several years now. But we want to make it more inclusive in terms of easier to download for people who don't have high internet rates and things like that. And the access policy, I think, is really, really exciting. And what's been really interesting since we announced it, we've had a lot of engagement from people who are in the community. There's several MAs which are about captioning, best practice, and can we push practice so it's not just doing some kind of half-assed captions, but actually make it part of our creative practice and engage with it in really creative ways. But there's also been some tensions around the burden that puts onto researchers who might not have funding in place to put those things in place professionally. And so there's dialogues going on about whether we can get our back catalogue captioned through work experience with people who are on those MAs, but also how we can support people in doing it well, so that it's not just kind of an afterthought. So really, really exciting, and really grateful to Catherine and Shweta for kind of bringing. That's why we called for, when in our call for new expressions of interest to join the journal, these are things that we really wanted to address in terms of bringing new blood and new thoughts and new ideas, and we're really excited about this new the new cohort and the direction. But again, we're very welcome to have feedback and comments from people who aren't on the team about other things that you think we should be thinking about and addressing.
Yes, thank you, Shara. And I have a couple of follow-up questions to the captioning policy and accessibility things, but I see that we have a hand raised for Pratap. Yes, yes, welcome.
Yeah.
Yes, go ahead. Yes.
Thanks, Will. I really appreciated Shweta's formulation of the problematic that we've got at the moment, where increasingly there are more vocal, clear emphases on inclusion and how we reach out to people. And then there's the gap between that. I'm sure it's very genuine in many cases, but in some cases it can feel a bit more like virtue signaling, in the sense that I'm not seeing, and I'd include myself and MPE, the editorial board I'm involved with, and maybe more boards than that. I'd include that in this, that I'm not quite seeing what the clear strategies are to achieve that. And the gap between those two things is the thing that we need to be measuring our progress by. So I just really welcome that conversation. I imagine it will come up in the afternoon panel, which will reflect a little bit on our new editorial board on MPE and new editors, and the editorial, which has this as a big emphasis. So we're trying to kind of point towards direction, but I'd really value colleagues kind of sharing best practice, if you like, and how we're actually changing the diversity range of practices that we feature.
We're at the beginning of the journey, and we very much want it to not be about virtual signalling. That's very important. And I know Estrella's developing a special issue. I don't know if you wanted to speak about that, which we hope will kind of put our what's the cliche? Put our thingy where our mouth is, or trousers, or whatever. I don't know, but show in action what we're intending to do. So do you want to talk about your special issue, Sarah?
Yes, of course. This is still at a very early stage. We will be stopping our production in August. So I think that we will be launching it at some point in September for publication next year. And it's going to be, can I say it? Can I reveal it already? It's going to be a special issue on ethnomusicology as well. And the idea is to try and include many people, many researchers from across disciplines, which are joined through this aspect of practice and research, and to do this in a collaborative way, bringing as well voices from the Global South. One of the ways in which we have been trying to do that already is by appointing reviewers from across regions, some of which had never reviewed for a creative piece in the past. So it's also been a learning process, but this can be now ambassadors that will reach out and spread the word about the journal, and maybe even be encouraged to publish themselves, because we have appointed them as reviewers because of the work that I do. So the idea is to launch this special issue on ethnomusicology, which has been for a long time claiming the need to record and visually record these music practices, and to see where we can intersect with this with film production and research statements. And what we are going to do is to do this with another research group and network to make sure that this can as well broaden our scope and our, I don't want to reveal too much information yet, but watch out for the call.
But I think that strategy of inviting more diverse array of reviewers from different disciplines, but also different countries that perhaps haven't been represented within the review board, because review boards are developed through people that we know, and they can be quite, a closed shop. And I think that's a really healthy strategy, because I think as Matthew's now joined the board, having been a reviewer, the process of reviewing opens up a kind of a relationship, which then can kind of echo out into the wider research community where you are. So I think that's a really interesting intervention that Estrella's bringing. We've also developed recently a policy on how to approach us if you're interested in doing a special issue, and that's on our website, on the screenworks.org.uk website. So if anybody's interested to know, there's a few people in the audience that have mooted special issues, and we've kind of now got a structure by which we hope to be able to kind of evaluate the people that are approaching us to do special issues. But yes, we're very open to special issues which address issues of equality, diversity and inclusion in a direct, proactive way, rather than just in a all mouth and no trousers way. But
maybe we could do that. We could do something in a coordinated or joint way between MP and Screenworks. They're such strong.
Well, we've mooted working together again, and I'd really be delighted. We have done a recent special issue on pedagogy with the Journal of Media Practice Education, which is wonderful issue that was edited by I've completely gone blank of who our colleague was. Lucy Leake, at Plymouth Arts, and that was a really successful collaboration. So we're really keen to do special issues in partnership, and really, we really love to work with you guys again, especially under the new editorship as well. It's great to have you on board as well.
And Craig Batty and Parrow, they're our new co-editors. So one in California of Indian origin and one in Australia, and that whole process of recruiting new co-editors, and we set it up as a co-editorship, did produce applications from Africa and elsewhere, and we're continuing that relationship to see whether we can work more closely with those colleagues. And I just wonder, when that's a lot of work, isn't it? And I just wonder whether we can spread those opportunities between our small communities a bit more.
I think it's a great idea to share reviewers, and or put us in touch or approach each other if we need some something reviewed that we haven't got the expertise or the kind of contacts or the networks to do. I think that's a really good idea. Be lovely to work in a closer association. But yeah, I'm really grateful for the new blood on our editorial team, and similar to you, it's kind of it's just brought so much already. You've only been joined since January, and I've so valued your interventions. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. We have our 10-minute warning, but we've mentioned the caption policy, our new caption policy, several times, but I think we should talk about it in a more deliberate way. And I'll direct this question to Catherine and Shweta. Could you just provide a summary of how the policy came into being, and why it is important for publications like ours to require captions for works, and a general overview of what the response has been? I know we've touched on these in the last few answers, but just to follow up, and anything you might like to add.
Okay, sorry, I'm not sure who goes first. One of the interesting things out of the captions policy, so there's two things that were kind of new and interesting for me, because captions have been a part of the industry for a while now. And one of them was talking with Alice Ewing, who is a capital D deaf viewer, and understanding a lot more about the experience of what it's like for her, and also what works and what doesn't work, because I think I'd been doing that thing of treating captions like subtitles, and I just hadn't really thought through that when people are saying something, I actually can hear the timbre of the voice, even if I don't understand the words. But she doesn't even have that. And so all these kinds of devices to think about, okay, how can we make that really clear for someone who is deaf? And the different ability to read and the speeds and things like that. But from Shweta, what I found really interesting was the way that you brought up this whole way of it becoming part of your process. So it's not something you just pop at the end, that this accessibility is part of that whole kind of process. And I wonder if I can pass to you on that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Interestingly, this also how captions and subtitles relate to broader contexts of consumption of video work is also that I mean, if say a lot of Indian filmmakers want their work to reach anywhere, especially if they're making documentaries on certain communities, they will most definitely at least subtitle it. And it was always interesting to me when I came here about 5 years ago to do my PhD, that it was just assumed that everyone would understand everything. And that was the first point where I also felt slightly excluded, but that's not to say, in the same capital D deaf way. Yeah, more broadly, as my PhD research has gone forward, I've realized that there is already a lot of very interesting work being done by disabled and deaf academics on, increasing access more broadly. So whether it's integrated audio descriptions or creative audio descriptions, which are incorporated into the work. So it's not like we've already mentioned, it's not an afterthought, but it's a part of the structure. So if you have a voiceover, your voiceover's essentially, giving you some context of what's visually there on screen. And there might be, I think some of the responses that came into the accessibility policy were in some ways saying that how does this restrict the work, or how does this shape the work in ways that we might not necessarily want to shape it, or how do we interpret like what the captions are saying on screen? How do they limit how people are able to interpret the work or experience the work? And that is something which I think connects to how it currently exists, where captions are an afterthought, or audio description is an afterthought, because it's very mellow and one note in the way it kind of expresses the work. So if one thinks of audio descriptions as well as captions more creatively as part of the work, it automatically then also it becomes a tool rather than a limitation to kind of engage audiences. And that's something that there's so much to learn about from a lot of the disabled and deaf work that's already going on. So I highly recommend Disability Arts Online in the UK context, which has a lot of interesting work on this already. It's basically like a lot of deaf and disabled artists who their work is on there, and there is some on captioning and audio description. So yeah.
Could you post a link to that in the chat, Shweta?
Yes.
That'd be really helpful. I mean, I just think it's so fascinating and interesting, and we're at the beginning of this journey and we don't know everything, and we're really open to feedback and stuff like that, but we just felt like we had to start somewhere, and it's a new phase, but anyone that's submitting anything that's going to be accepted for publication in the next volume, which will be starting in September, will need to be thinking about this, and that adds a burden onto people, but we think it's a burden that like the peer review process, which can sometimes be painful, we hope will actually be part of the creative process and enhance the work, and as well as making it more accessible to other people. So there's a comment from Roy: the best use of captions I've ever seen is not only creative but designed into the visual style, and the film was Night Watch. Ooh.
Thank you for the thoughts on the new caption policy. It's very exciting. I know that the journal has received several positive responses already, so hopefully we'll see it more and more in practice research journals and just in work more generally. Another question, and I'll direct this again to you, Shweta, in this vein, and thinking about how the journal can be more diverse and inclusive. We've been discussing lately at editorial board meetings this notion of digital inclusion. And I'm wondering if you could, what is digital inclusion? How should it shape the work that we do? And what can we in other journals do better going forward?
I like the weight of that question, which I will not probably be able to sort of respond to fully. But I mean, I think so digital inclusion, more as understood in most sort of common terms, is access to the question of access to the internet supported devices, computers, I mean, in the context of, say, filmmaking, it would be technology or whatever we need to make films, but more broadly also just digital literacy and confidence that comes with digital literacy, right? So we're looking at not just having a mobile phone, but what do we do? What are we able to do with it? And within our context of practice-based research, what do we do with the technology that we have? Do we even think that these are options available once we have access to that technology? I think, so in terms of Screenworks, we've been exploring how to make the website more easily, more easy to load, or material that can be downloaded, as Charlotte also said, in lower internet speeds. But I mean, more broadly, we're also going to go forward with some questions, I think, of not just how do we make it accessible to people who do not have access, but what access do people currently have? What are they making, and how do we welcome that onto, as a team? How do we look at, say, for example, if I'm looking at the Indian context, there are a lot of communities that are currently doing very, there has been a major proliferation of access to mobile phones and, say, social media, TikTok especially, not in India anymore because it was banned, but people made very interesting work, and there were various ways in which there was resistance to the norm. There's a lot of sort of caste-based, anti-caste work that is coming up from there. And so it's not just about how do we make it accessible, what currently exists to communities that don't have digital access necessarily, but what are they making and how do we welcome that on board? So it's more of what are we missing out on rather than what are they missing out on, if you know what I mean. So yeah, that I think is one thing. And more broadly, again, this is hopefully I've seen some very good examples of good practice at the University of Reading at my department, where if there was a conference, then there were bursaries, funding was prioritized to researchers who were based in the global south, not just people who are based here and can access opportunities once they are here, because there is a very, very big, not just digital, but a very big, financial divide, right? To be able to access conference fees and whatnot. So having those bursaries available can help more and more researchers actually present their work here. And then they have the confidence to submit to journals and, so on and so forth. So yeah, that's what I would also say. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I see that we have our 2-minute warning. I just wanted to say thank you all for joining us. We did have one question that was in the chat that we did not get to, and I realized that I copy and pasted it, but did not include the person's name, and it was far earlier in the chat, so I do apologize. And this is, I believe, was for Charlotte, and I think could be a good way to end. Are you detecting any change, increased recognition of practice-based research in the current ref?
Well, I wasn't involved in the assessment of the first ref, and I know, from my experience, the current ref is very open to practice. There are disparities in the way that institutions frame and submit the practice. So I think that some institutions still need to do more work on how they understand practice research and how they frame it with the 300-word statement, and whether they put something into a kind of a multi-component portfolio or that kind of thing. The other thing I would say is that there's some practice which I think potentially, you need to think about double weighting. So when you do a ref submission, if you've done a sort of hefty book, a big tome, that's usually double weighted and it counts as 2 outputs. And the amount of work that practice people have to do to justify their practice as being research. So if you take the example of Bluebell that Darren was introducing, when I submitted that to, I think it was to RAE 2008, but I did this kind of belt and braces thing where I had the thing, it was on Screenworks, it had a festival run, I'd written an article, it had a website, and it's kind of, and if you actually look at the amount of work, an article is an output in its own right. And then you've got practice. So that should have been a double weighted output, but I don't think that was an option at that time. What I'm trying to say is that I actually do think the ref, and I also think the AHRC is very open to practice. It's taken away a specific grant that's aimed at practice, but practice is very welcomed in the standard research grant applications. But just with any application and any research, it needs to demonstrate its originality, significance and rigor, pathways to impact, all of that horrible neoliberal jargon, but actually it's quite a useful framework for thinking about our research. And so I don't have a strict answer, Pratap, because it's my first time being involved actually on the panel. But I do think that there's work still to be done by submitting institutions in best framing practice to show the research insights. I think there's still work to be done. Some institutions are doing that incredibly well. Others haven't quite managed to learn the language, and it is a language, as Shweta said. It can be an exclusionary language, and I think Screenworks hopes to be part of kind of that dialogue and that language, developing that language and helping people to articulate their practice as research. I would say the special issue policy isn't online yet because I think we haven't ratified it. It will be ratified in our July board meeting, and then the special issue policy will be online. So if you're thinking of submitting a special issue, then look out for that in early July.
Thank you very much. And yes, that question was from Pratap, so I apologize for neglecting your name there. Thank you all very much for joining us, and I suppose I'll turn it back over to Roy. Thank you.